Winter, 1943. The forests of Eastern Europe lay buried under snow, their branches heavy with ice, their silence broken only by the crunch of boots on frozen ground. Elias Novak, only 21, carried a leather satchel pressed tightly against his chest. Inside was a package he had never opened, sealed with wax and marked with a symbol he did not recognize. He had been told only one thing: deliver it west, no matter the cost. The cold gnawed at him with every step. His breath rose in pale clouds, drifting into the still air before vanishing into the gray sky. The war had stripped the land bare, villages reduced to blackened shells, fields frozen and lifeless, roads patrolled by men whose language was not his own. Elias had learned to move like a shadow, to keep to the tree lines, to trust no one. By dusk, he reached a village that seemed abandoned. Snow covered the roofs, doors were barred, windows shattered. Yet, from one chimney a thin ribbon of smoke curled upward. He hesitated, then approached. A woman appeared in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes hollow. She studied him in silence, as if weighing his soul. Finally she whispered, "The patrols come at night. If you stay, you will die." Before he could answer, she pressed a crust of bread into his hand. Her fingers trembled, as though she were giving away her last possession. Elias wanted to thank her, but words felt too heavy. He slipped the bread into his coat and moved on, vanishing into the forest before the sound of engines returned. That night, he found shelter in the ruins of a church. The roof had collapsed. Snow drifted across the stone floor, but the walls still stood. He crouched in the shadows, clutching the satchel, listening to the distant rumble of trucks. The stained glass windows were shattered, yet fragments of color still clung to the frames, glowing faintly in the moonlight. He thought of his family, his father taken east, his mother lost in the chaos of evacuation, his younger sister, whose laughter he could no longer remember clearly. He wondered if they still lived, or if he carried this burden for no one at all. Sleep came fitfully. In his dreams, he saw the package open, spilling maps and names across the snow. He saw men in uniforms chasing him, their boots pounding like drums. He woke with a start, heart racing, the satchel still clutched to his chest. The wax seal was unbroken. He exhaled slowly, though the fear lingered. At dawn, he moved again. The forest was alive with crows, their wings black against the pale sky. He followed a frozen stream, careful to leave no tracks on the banks. Once, he heard voices. German soldiers, laughing, their rifles slung casually as they marched. He pressed himself flat against the snow, barely breathing, until they passed. Only when the silence returned did he rise and continue westward. By midday he reached a crossroads where a wooden signpost leaned drunkenly in the snow. The names had been painted over, replaced with the German script. Elias studied it, then turned south, trusting the directions he had memorized. Every step felt heavier, as though the satchel grew in weight. He told himself it was only his imagination, but the thought gnawed at him. What if the package contained something more than papers? What if it was the reason men were dying in villages like the one he had passed? That evening, he found a barn on the edge of a field. The doors hung loose, the hay inside frozen stiff, but it was shelter. He crawled into the loft, wrapping himself in his coat. As darkness fell, he heard the sound of boots crunching outside. A patrol. He held his breath, clutching the satchel, praying they would pass. The boots stopped. A voice barked in German. Another answered. For a moment, Elias thought they would enter. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the boots moved on, fading into the night. He lay awake long after, staring at the rafters. The satchel rested against his chest, its leather cold against his skin. He whispered to himself, a promise he had made when he accepted the mission. Deliver it west, no matter the cost. The words were both a vow and a curse. He closed his eyes, knowing tomorrow would bring another day of silence, fear, and footsteps in the snow. And somewhere beyond the horizon, men waited for what he carried. Men who believed it could change the course of the war. Whether they were right or wrong, Elias no longer cared. His duty was simple, his path endless. The ruin smelled of smoke and damp stone. Elias lit no fire, though the cold gnawed at his bones. He listened instead to the distant rumble of engines. German convoys moving supplies to the front. In the silence, he thought of his family, scattered by the war. He wondered if the package he carried could change anything, or if it was just another desperate hope. The morning came gray and bitter. Elias left the church ruins before the sun had fully risen, moving quickly along the tree line. His boots crunched softly on the frozen ground, each step measured, each breath controlled. He had learned to walk like a shadow, to blend into the silence of the forest. Still, the satchel pressed against his chest felt heavier with every mile, as though it carried not only secrets, but the weight of every life already lost. By midday, he reached a clearing where a road cut through the forest. He crouched low, scanning the horizon. A convoy of trucks rattled past, their engines coughing black smoke into the pale sky. Soldiers sat in the back, rifles slung across their shoulders, their faces blank with fatigue. Elias waited until the last truck disappeared, then darted across the road, his heart pounding. That evening, he stumbled upon two other couriers. They emerged from the trees cautiously, hands raised to show they carried no weapons. Passwords were exchanged in whispers, the kind only the resistance knew. For the first time in weeks, Elias felt a flicker of relief. They shared bread and water, crouched in the shadows of a ruined farmhouse. One of them, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, spoke of safe houses further west. The other, younger and restless, warned of patrols tightening their grip on the region. For a brief moment, Elias allowed himself to believe he was not alone. They laughed quietly, trading stories of narrow escapes, of coded messages hidden in letters, of comrades who had vanished without a trace. Yet trust was fragile. That night, as Elias dozed lightly in the corner of the farmhouse, he woke to find the younger courier gone. His blanket lay crumpled, his footprints leading out into the snow. A chill ran through Elias that had nothing to do with the cold. Hours later, the sound of boots shattered the silence. German voices barked orders outside. Elias's blood froze. The betrayal was clear. He grabbed the satchel and bolted through the back, sprinting into the night as shouts erupted behind him. Bullets cracked through the air, splintering wood and stone. He ran blindly, his lungs burning, until he reached a wooden bridge spanning a half-frozen river. The planks groaned beneath his boots as he dashed across. Behind him, soldiers shouted, their rifles flashing in the dark. Elias reached the far side and, with trembling hands, cut the ropes that held the bridge. The structure collapsed into the icy water with a thunderous crash, sending shards of wood and ice spraying into the air. The soldiers cursed, their voices fading as Elias stumbled into the forest, his chest heaving, his legs weak. He did not stop until the trees swallowed him whole. Collapsing against a trunk, he pressed the satchel to his chest, his breath ragged. The betrayal cut deeper than the bullets. He had trusted, and it had nearly cost him everything. By dawn, he found a barn on the edge of a field. The doors hung loose, the hay inside frozen stiff, but it was shelter. He crawled into the loft, wrapping himself in his coat. The smell of straw and dust filled his lungs. He lay awake, staring at the rafters, listening to the wind rattle the boards. Every creak sounded like footsteps. Every gust of wind like a whisper of pursuit. He tore a piece of the bread the scarred courier had given him, chewing slowly, tasting bitterness more than grain. He whispered the words that had become his anchor. Deliver it west, no matter the cost. The barn groaned in the wind, the world outside frozen and hostile. Elias closed his eyes, though sleep did not come. He knew the road ahead would only grow darker. The satchel was no longer just a burden. It was a beacon, and men would kill to claim it. By spring, Elias had crossed into the mountains. Snow melted into rivers that roared with the thaw, and the forest came alive with birdsong. Yet the war was never far. Burned villages dotted the valleys, and every stranger's glance carried suspicion. One night, in a mountain inn, a man in a gray coat asked too many questions. Elias lied, but the man's eyes followed him long after he left. The mountains were both a refuge and a prison. Paths twisted endlessly, and avalanches had buried whole trails beneath walls of ice. Elias moved carefully, guided by scraps of maps and whispered directions from villagers who still dared to resist. Each day he climbed higher, his breath thin in the cold air, his legs aching with exhaustion. Yet the satchel never left his chest. It was as though it had fused with him, a second heart beating against his ribs. At a small inn perched on the edge of a valley, Elias sought shelter. The innkeeper, a weary man with hands cracked from years of labor, gave him a bowl of thin soup and a place by the fire. Other travelers sat in silence, their faces shadowed by the flickering light. Among them was a man in a gray coat, his hair neatly combed, his boots polished. He smiled too easily, asked too many questions. Where was Elias from? Where was he going? Did he travel alone? Elias answered with half-truths, claiming to be a farmhand searching for work. The man nodded politely, but his eyes lingered on the satchel. That night, Elias left before dawn. The inn still slept, but as he stepped into the cold air, he felt the weight of eyes on his back. He turned once and saw the man in the gray coat standing at the window watching. The following days were filled with unease. On narrow trails, Elias noticed footprints shadowing his own. Once he doubled back and hid among the rocks, waiting. Hours later, the man in the gray coat appeared, moving steadily along the path Elias had taken. Fear tightened his chest. The package was no longer just a burden. It was a beacon, drawing danger to him. He pressed deeper into the mountains, climbing paths where snow still clung stubbornly to the peaks. The air was sharp, the wind cutting like knives. He found shelter in a shepherd's hut, abandoned but still standing. Inside he lit no fire, though the cold gnawed at his bones. He sat in the dark, listening to the wind howl through the cracks, clutching the satchel as though it might vanish if he let go. Sleep came in fragments. In his dreams, he saw the man in the gray coat standing over him, reaching for the satchel. He woke with a start, heart pounding, sweat freezing on his skin. He whispered to himself the words that had become his anchor. Deliver it west, no matter the cost. The next morning, he continued his climb. The trail grew steeper and the rocks slick with melting snow. Below him, valleys stretched wide, dotted with villages scarred by fire. Smoke rose from chimneys, but Elias dared not enter. He had learned that not all who smiled were friends. One evening, as the sun bled red across the peaks, Elias reached the ridge overlooking a narrow pass. From there, he saw German soldiers moving in columns, their helmets glinting in the fading light. Trucks rumbled behind them, engines echoing through the valley. He crouched low, his breath shallow, watching as they disappeared into the distance. The war was everywhere, even here, in the high places where once only shepherds had walked. That night, he found another hut, this one with a broken roof and walls scarred by bullets. He sat on the floor, the satchel in his lap, and thought of the people he had met, the woman who had given him bread, the couriers who had betrayed him, the scarred man who had shared warnings by the fire. Each face lingered in his mind, a reminder of the cost already paid. The satchel seemed heavier than ever. He no longer asked what it contained. He feared the answer. The satchel grew heavier with each mile, though its weight never changed. Elias began to dream of it, hearing whispers when he closed his eyes. In one dream, he saw a map burning, cities vanishing in flame. He woke drenched in sweat, clutching the package as if it might vanish. He no longer asked what it contained. He feared the answer. The mountains gave way to dense forests, where the trees grew so close together that daylight barely reached the ground. Elias moved cautiously, his boots sinking into damp earth, his ears straining for every sound. The war was everywhere, even in the silence. Birds scattered at sudden noises, and once he thought he heard a child crying, only to find the sound was the wind whistling through broken branches. One afternoon, as he followed a narrow trail, the forest erupted with gunfire. Bullets tore through the trees, splintering bark around him. Elias dropped to the ground, rolling into the undergrowth. Shouts echoed in German, boots pounding against the soil. He crawled on his belly, mud soaking his coat, until he reached a shallow ravine. Without hesitation, he slid down into the icy water, letting the current drag him downstream. The river was merciless. It pulled him under, spun him against rocks, filled his lungs with freezing water. Yet somehow, through sheer desperation, he clung to the satchel. When he finally dragged himself onto the far bank, he lay gasping, his body trembling with exhaustion. The voices of the soldiers faded behind him, swallowed by the roar of the river. As he staggered to his feet, a figure emerged from the trees. A tall man in a long coat, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. He carried papers stamped with foreign seals and spoke in a clipped, precise accent. "You must be Elias," the man said quietly. "I've been waiting." The stranger introduced himself as Calder, an agent of the Allies. He knew the symbol on the wax seal. He knew what Elias carried. For the first time in months, Elias felt both relief and dread. The burden was no longer his alone. It was history itself, pressed against his chest. That night, they camped in the ruins of a farmhouse. Calder lit a small fire, its glow barely enough to warm their hands. He spoke in low tones, explaining that the package contained intelligence stolen from deep within the Reich. Plans that could shorten the war if they reached London. Elias listened in silence, the weight of his journey settling on him like a stone. But even as Calder spoke, Elias could not shake the feeling of being watched. The forest seemed alive with unseen eyes. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made his hand tighten on the satchel. He wondered if the man in the gray coat still followed, or if others had taken his place. Sleep came reluctantly. Elias dreamed again of fire, cities burning, rivers choked with smoke, faces he could not save. He woke to find Calder already awake, scanning the tree line with sharp eyes. "We move at first light," the agent said. "The longer we linger, the closer they come." As dawn broke, they set out together, two shadows moving westward through a land scarred by war. Elias no longer walked alone, yet the burden felt heavier than ever. For now, the satchel was safe. But he knew the journey was far from over. The agent's name was Calder. He spoke with a clipped British accent and carried papers that opened doors. Elias could not. Calder explained that the package contained intelligence stolen from deep within the Reich, plans that could shorten the war if they reached London. Elias felt both relief and dread. The burden was no longer abstract. It was history itself, pressed against his chest. For the first time in months, Elias did not walk alone. Calder moved with quiet confidence, his every step measured, his eyes scanning the horizon with the precision of a man who had lived too long in the shadows. He carried forged documents that allowed them to pass through checkpoints, and he seemed to know which roads were safe, which villages could be trusted, and which doors to avoid. Together, they boarded a train bound west. The carriages were crowded with soldiers, civilians, and refugees clutching bundles of belongings. Elias sat stiffly, the satchel hidden beneath his coat, while Calder leafed through a newspaper as though he were just another weary traveler. When soldiers entered the carriage to check papers, Calder handed over his documents with a calm smile. The officer glanced at them, nodded, and moved on. Elias exhaled slowly, his hands trembling beneath the folds of his coat. But safety was an illusion. In a small town along the route, they sought shelter in a safe house run by sympathizers. The woman who welcomed them offered food and warmth, her voice soft, her eyes kind. Yet Calder's gaze lingered on her too long, suspicion flickering in his expression. That night, as Elias dozed in the corner, he woke to the sound of voices outside. Soldiers. The woman had betrayed them. They fled through the back, sprinting across cobblestones as shouts erupted behind them. Bullets cracked through the night, ricocheting off stone walls. Calder pulled Elias into an alley, thrusting him against the shadows. "We moved to the station," he hissed. "It's our only chance." The station was chaos. Refugees pressed against the gates, soldiers barked orders, trains screeched on the tracks. Calder guided Elias through the crowd, his forged papers once again opening doors. They boarded a freight car, its floor littered with straw and crates. The train lurched forward, carrying them westward into the night. But the danger followed. At the next stop, soldiers boarded, searching the cars. Elias hid beneath the crates, clutching the satchel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Boots thundered above him, voices barked orders, and for a moment he thought it was over. Then, as suddenly as they had come, the soldiers moved on. The train groaned, the whistle blew, and they were moving again. Hours later, the world above them exploded. Bombs fell from the sky, shattering the city they had just entered. Fire consumed the streets. Buildings collapsed in showers of sparks and stone. The train screeched to a halt, passengers screaming as glass shattered. Calder grabbed Elias by the arm, dragging him through the chaos. Together, they stumbled into the burning streets, the satchel still pressed against Elias's chest. The night was a storm of fire and smoke. Sirens wailed, planes roared overhead, and the ground shook with every blast. Elias could barely see through the haze, but he followed Calder's voice, each word cutting through the roar of destruction. They ducked into alleys, leapt over rubble, and pressed themselves against walls as buildings crumbled around them. Through it all, Elias never let go of the satchel. Even as the world burned, even as the sky itself seemed to fall, he carried it forward. When at last they found shelter in the ruins of a cellar, Elias collapsed against the wall, his chest heaving. Calder sat opposite him, his face streaked with soot, his eyes hard. "This is only the beginning," the agent said quietly. "They will hunt us until this reaches London. You must be ready for that." Elias nodded, though his body trembled with exhaustion. He had survived betrayal, bullets, and fire. Yet he knew the road ahead would only grow darker. The satchel was no longer just a burden. It was a promise and a curse. In the chaos of the bombing, Elias lost Calder. The satchel was nearly torn from his hands, but he clung to it, stumbling through fire and rubble. He no longer knew whom to trust. Every uniform, every face in the crowd could mean death. Yet he pressed on, guided only by the promise he had made: deliver it west, no matter the cost. The city burned around him. Flames leaped from shattered windows, smoke rolled through the streets like a living thing, and the air was filled with the cries of the wounded. Elias staggered through the chaos, calling Calder's name, but the roar of collapsing buildings swallowed his voice. He searched desperately, scanning every face in the crowd, but the British agent was gone, lost to the fire, or worse. For a moment, despair threatened to crush him. Calder had been his guide, his shield, the one man who seemed to understand the weight of the satchel. Now, Elias was alone again, a shadow in a world of ruin. He pressed himself against a wall, clutching the leather strap so tightly it cut into his shoulder. The satchel was all that remained. He moved through the ruins like a ghost, slipping between alleys, ducking beneath falling beams. Once, a German patrol appeared at the far end of the street, their helmets glinting in the firelight. Elias froze, heart hammering, then darted into a cellar just as bullets tore into the wall behind him. He crouched in the dark, the smell of dust and blood thick in the air until the voices faded. When he emerged, the city was quieter, though the fires still raged. He walked past bodies lying in the rubble, their faces pale in the glow of the flames. He forced himself not to look, not to think. Every step forward was an act of will. Days blurred together after that. He moved westward on foot, avoiding roads, sleeping in barns and cellars, stealing food where he could. Hunger gnawed at him, but he never let go of the satchel. It was his curse, his anchor, the reason he still drew breath. One evening, as he crossed a ruined village, he heard faint voices beneath the rubble of a collapsed house. He hesitated, then pushed aside the stones. Beneath the wreckage, he found children, 3 of them, their faces streaked with soot, their eyes wide with fear. They clung to each other, too weak to cry. Elias gave them the last of his bread, breaking it into pieces with trembling hands. They ate in silence, staring at him as though he were some figure from a story. One of the children, a girl no older than 10, whispered, "Will it ever end?" Elias had no answer. Instead, he told them a tale, not of war, but of spring, of fields filled with flowers, of rivers running clear and bright. His voice was low, halting, but for a moment their fear eased. For a moment, he remembered why he carried the burden. He stayed with them through the night, keeping watch as they slept in the ruins. At dawn, he knew he could not remain. The satchel pulled him onward, mile by mile, toward the sea. The children clung to him when he rose, begging him not to leave. His heart ached, but he could not stay. He whispered a promise, that one day the world would be different, that they would see the fields of spring again. Then he turned away, the satchel heavy against his chest, and walked into the rising sun. The road ahead was uncertain, the dangers countless. But Elias knew only one truth: he could not stop. Calder was gone, the Allies scattered, the world burning. Yet the satchel remained. And as long as he carried it, there was still hope. By the summer of 1944, Elias reached the coast. The sea stretched endless and gray, a barrier and a promise. He found a fisherman willing to risk the crossing, hiding him beneath nets and barrels. As the boat rocked on the waves, Elias held the satchel close. He thought of the forests, the ruins, the faces of those who had helped him. He thought of Calder, lost in the fire. He thought of the woman in the village who had whispered, "Carry hope, even when you cannot carry yourself." The coast smelled of salt and smoke. German patrols prowled the harbors, their boots striking the wooden planks of the piers with mechanical rhythm. Elias kept to the shadows, moving only at night, watching the sea from the dunes. The water stretched before him like a wall of steel, the horizon blurred by mist. Beyond it lay England, safety, and the end of his journey. But between him and that shore lay the most dangerous passage of all. He met the fisherman in a shack that leaned against the dunes, its roof patched with tar and rope. The man's face was weathered, his hands calloused from years at sea. He spoke little, only nodding when Elias showed him the satchel. "Tonight," the fisherman muttered. "No later. The patrols grow restless." When darkness fell, they pushed the small boat into the surf. Elias crouched low, hidden beneath nets and barrels, the smell of fish thick in his nostrils. The waves rocked the vessel, each swell threatening to capsize it. The fisherman rowed with steady strokes, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Elias clutched the satchel, his knuckles white, his heart pounding with every creak of the oars. Halfway across, searchlights swept the water. German patrol boats prowled the waves, their engines growling, their beams slicing through the night. Elias held his breath as one of the lights passed over their boat, illuminating the nets above him. The fisherman froze, his oars still. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Then the light moved on, and the boat slipped back into darkness. But the danger was not gone. A patrol boat turned, its engine roaring as it cut across the waves. Gunfire cracked, bullets striking the water around them. The fisherman cursed, rowing with desperate strength. Elias pressed himself deeper beneath the nets, the satchel clutched to his chest as the boat lurched violently. Waves crashed over the sides, drenching him in salt and fear. The chase stretched into eternity. The fisherman steered toward a bank of fog, the patrol boat's spotlight sweeping wildly across the water. At last, the roar of the engine faded, swallowed by the mist. The small boat drifted in silence, the only sound the ragged breathing of two men who had risked everything. Hours later, the first light of dawn broke across the horizon. The gray sea turned silver, and in the distance Elias saw the faint outline of cliffs. England. His chest tightened, tears stinging his eyes. He had carried the satchel across forests, mountains, rivers, and fire. Now, at last, the end was in sight. As the boat scraped against the rocky shore, Elias stumbled onto the sand, his legs weak, his body trembling. He turned to thank the fisherman, but the man was already pushing the boat back into the waves, vanishing into the mist without a word. Elias stood alone, the satchel heavy against his chest, staring at the land that promised both safety and uncertainty. He thought of the faces that had carried him this far. The woman in the village, the scarred courier, the children in the cellar. Calder lost in the fire. Each of them had given him something: bread, warnings, hope, sacrifice. He whispered their names into the wind, a prayer carried across the sea. The journey was not yet over. Men in dark coats would come for the satchel, and with it the burden he had carried for so long. But for now, Elias allowed himself a single breath of relief. He had crossed the sea. He had kept his promise. When Elias finally stepped onto English soil, he felt the weight lift from his shoulders. The satchel was taken from him by men in dark coats who vanished into the night. He was given no thanks, no explanation, only silence. Yet, as he walked away, exhausted and alone, he realized something. The war was not won by generals alone. It was carried, mile by mile, by those who bore burdens in silence, and though history might never speak his name, the world would feel the echo of his footsteps. The cliffs of England rose behind him, stark and gray against the morning sky. The sea still roared in his ears, the salt clinging to his lips, but the journey across was done. He had delivered the satchel. The burden that had consumed his every breath for more than a year was gone, passed into the hands of men who spoke in clipped tones and carried themselves with the authority of secrets. They had not asked his name. They had not offered gratitude. They had simply taken the satchel and disappeared into the fog. Elias stood on the shore for a long time, staring at the horizon. He thought of the forests of his homeland, the ruins of villages, the faces of those who had helped him, the woman who had given him bread, the scarred courier who had warned him of patrols, the children in the cellar who had clung to him in the dark, Calder, lost in the fire. Each of them had carried a piece of the burden. Each of them had given him the strength to take another step. Now, with the satchel gone, he felt strangely hollow. His hands twitched, as though searching for the strap that had cut into his shoulder for so long. He had lived for the mission, survived for it, endured hunger, betrayal, and fire for it. Without it, who was he? He wandered inland, through quiet villages where life seemed untouched by war. Children played in the fields, their laughter sharp and bright against the silence he carried within. Farmers worked the land. Women hung laundry in the breeze. And for a moment, Elias felt as though he had stepped into another world. Yet even here, the war lingered. Posters called for vigilance. Soldiers marched through the streets, and the distant drone of planes reminded him that the struggle was far from over. In London, he was given a room in a boarding house. The walls were thin, the bed narrow, but it was warm, and for the first time in months he slept without clutching the satchel to his chest. Still, the dreams came. He saw maps burning, cities vanishing in flame, faces he could not save. He woke in the dark, drenched in sweat, whispering the words that had carried him across a continent. Deliver it west, no matter the cost. Days turned into weeks. He was summoned once to a dimly lit office where men in suits asked him to recount his journey. He spoke of forests and rivers, of betrayals and narrow escapes, of Calder and the children in the cellar. They listened in silence, taking notes, their faces unreadable. When he finished, they dismissed him with a nod. No medals, no speeches, no promises. Only silence. Elias left the office and walked into the streets of London. The city was scarred by war. Buildings reduced to rubble, windows shattered, smoke still rising from the ruins of bombings. Yet life went on. People queued for bread, buses rumbled through the streets, and in the distance, church bells rang. He realized then that his journey had never been about recognition. The satchel had not been his to keep, nor the secrets within it his to know. His role had been simple: to carry hope across a continent, to keep it alive when others could not. And though history might never speak his name, the world would feel the echo of his footsteps. One evening, as the sun set over the Thames, Elias stood on a bridge and watched the water flow beneath him. He thought of home, of the forests and fields he might never see again. He thought of the faces that had guided him, the voices that had whispered courage into his heart. He closed his eyes and let the wind carry their memory. The war was not yet over. Battles still raged, lives were still lost, and the world still trembled on the edge of ruin. But Elias had done his part. He had carried the burden mile by mile, through fire and snow, across rivers and seas. He had delivered it west. And in that moment, standing alone on the bridge, he understood. Sometimes the greatest victories are the ones no one will ever see.